All right, we are live. Rejoining me today is an extra special guest, David Papineau. So David, for those who might not know you, I assume most people know you, but just in case there's someone out there who doesn't, can you say something about who you are and what you do?
I'm a philosopher. I've always been a philosopher, well, as long as I can remember, many years now. And I work on, I used to think of myself as a philosopher of science and epistemologist, but I've become much more engaged with metaphysics and philosophy of mind as my thinking's developed. I still think of myself as philosopher of science, philosopher of biology, and I've been teaching. I teach now at King's College London. I've been teaching at the University of New York Graduate School, but that's stopped for the time because of COVID. So I'm based in London, and I've just finished this book, The Metaphysics of Sensory Experience, which is in press with OUP, and I'm writing another book on, I think it's going to be called The Metaphysics of Causation. So there you are, metaphysician.
Wow.
Identify.
Wow. So this book, The Metaphysics of Sensory Experience, is coming out. You said it should be actually in print by March of next year.
Yeah, well, I tweeted earlier. I said my new book. I'm going to be talking about it to Richard, and then I realized after I tweeted, but people are going to think the book's available, but it's not. So I thought, well, maybe and so I went on Amazon. And there it was. It's OUP. I sent them the final manuscript, I don't know, 6 weeks ago, and they're all buzzing away and getting a cover ready, and you can pre-order it, and it's due out on March the 1st. We'll see if they stick to that deadline, but that's pretty good.
Okay, good. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it being in print. I think it's a good book. It makes an excellent contribution. I'm also interested in this other book you're working on, The Metaphysics of Causation. That sounds interesting too, but I guess we'll have to have you back a third time later to talk about that whenever you make some progress on that. But this book, give you a little bit of time, exactly, catch your breath and work it out. This book is quite good, so I really enjoyed. I'm glad I got a sneak peek at it. I think it raises a host of issues, which, as you say in the book, it's sort of surprising that there aren't very many, or even anyone with the view that you kind of want to defend in this book. So I think it's a needed kind of contribution, and I think it's going to generate a lot of discussion. So I would kind of just want to start by asking you about the title. You say something in the introduction about this, but you would normally expect something like the metaphysics of perception or, something like that. So why did you choose the sensory experience as your target?
Well, the trivial reason, and now you ask me, I suddenly had a pang. Why didn't I just call it the metaphysics of perception? People understand better. But it's because perception's a success verb. Success, you perceive something, it means you're perceiving accurately. If you have an illusion or hallucination, then you're not perceiving. Your perceiving means there's a fact there, and you're kind of locked onto it perceptually.
Right.
And I'm of the view. Many people in philosophy of perception, not just people who have my specific view, want to say that what's going on in conscious sensory experience is the same when you're having illusion or hallucination as when you're having a perception. And that's the thing I'm interested in. Don't want to prejudge anything either way, but I'm interested in what's going on when you have conscious sensory experiences. And so I've kind of found myself more and more avoiding the term perception, because it is the natural term for people who have one view in this area, naive realism, and not for people who don't. Having said that, most people kind of ignore that. They regard the area as the philosophy of perception, even if they're not naive realists.
Right.
So
yeah.
Maybe I was making a bit of a point.
That people should pay attention to this distinction, because I think it's right.
Everybody's aware of the distinction, and nobody wants to kind of prejudge and presuppose people out of the debate just by using the term perception. But nothing much hangs on it.
Yeah, so the basic idea is you're just trying to capture whatever's in common between the hallucinatory cases and the dream experiences. And
I don't want to
direct
presuppose
ones.
that there's something in common. I mean, I discussed naive realism. It's not a big feature of the book what I say about naive realism, but I do tend to it, and they don't think there is anything in common or nothing fundamental in common, as they put it. So no, I want to talk about conscious sensory experience, but I do want to talk about what in the trade are called the bad cases, the illusions and the hallucinations, as well as the veridical perceptions. So,
right, I see. So it's not that there's something in common. You just want to include both cases, the bad and the
exactly.
Of course, you do argue that there's something in common. So you
so I do argue there's something in common. I do think there's something in common, but I don't want to presuppose that from the start. To be honest, the more interesting thing about the title is not the metaphysics of sensory experience, but the metaphysics of sensory experience. Because many people who work on perception are more focused not on just the nature of what's going on when you have conscious experience, but on the implications for epistemology, the possibility of knowledge, the possibility of referring to things in the external world, the possibility of having reasons for your beliefs, all kinds of associated issues. And as you will have seen if you read the book, none of that features very prominently in what I'm talking about. I mean, I don't want to say that these things don't matter and that you can't, in the end, want a theory of perception that fits together with those things, but I focus very much just on the metaphysical nature of what's going on when you have conscious sensory experiences.
Right. Yeah, I think that's right. So a lot of the metaphysics is often in the background. They sort of say a couple of things and then they're off to these other sort of what does it do or what is it good for? And those are important questions, but it's also important to get clear on what it is. And like you say, naive realism doesn't figure very prominent. I mean, there's a chapter on it, but mostly the target is representationalism. And so I want to talk about that, but I thought I can't resist talking about naive realism a little bit because I thought that one of the arguments that you gave was really interesting, and that's the time lag argument, which I hadn't really seen developed anywhere else. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about that before we move on.
Just to be clear, you said it's not a whole chapter. I mean, I've got a preliminary chapter dealing with various preliminary issues, and I mean, a good chunk of it, a third of it is about naive realism, but I'm kind of discussing it really to put it to one side. I want to show where I stand. It's a bit of a reference point. But as you say, I mean, representationalism, which I regard as perhaps the dominant view in this area, is my main foil. And there's a whole chapter then on what I think is wrong with representationalism. But the time lag argument. So naive realism is the view, perhaps a rather natural, intuitive view, that when you're having conscious sensory experience, the real things out there that you're observing are part of your experience, that your experience, as it were, reaches out and incorporates. You can't see. Shall I turn my computer around? You can see it. The car outside my window, that's my beat up old car. And so I can perceive my grey car. And this view says that the car, the shape of the car, the greyness of the car are literally part of my conscious experience. And the state I'm in when I have a conscious sensory experience is a relational state. So it's a state of my being in a relation to the objective, worldly, non-mental fact that the car is grey. And that's fine. I mean, that's kind of pretty natural view. I mean, one can put pressure on it pretty quickly by saying what's going on in the bad cases where I'm having an illusion that the car is grey when it's not grey. It looks like I'm in the same conscious state, but no fact there to be related to. That's the basic issue for naive realism. But I raise this other difficulty that I say, look, a lot of the things that we observe are in the past. I mean, most obviously astronomical events and flares in the sun, supernovae, many light years away. They happened a long time ago. And now the thought is that my current conscious sensory state is a relation between me and this long past fact. How can that be? How can my current conscious sensory experience involve or have a part that's long over? And surely my sensory experience only began, a few moments ago when I turned my eyes in that direction. So that's the basic challenge. And surprisingly, there is very little discussion of this in the literature. I mean, it's reminiscent of a argument that sense data theorists used in favor of sense data and against any kind of, I guess, against similar naive realist views. But somehow it's considered not to be telling, or the naive realists aren't really bothered about it. I mean, there's only 1 or 2 papers, as far as I know, that address this issue.
Yeah, so part of the challenge is that conscious experience is kind of a concrete current thing. And so the puzzle is, how does it incorporate things that existed in the past? I mean, you mentioned the supernova. All you need is like the sunrise, really, because it takes 8 minutes for sunlight from the sun to get here. But even as you say in the book, I think even things that are directly in front of you are going to have some minuscule lag. It takes light a fraction of a second to get to you. So when I was reading this, I was like, yeah, this is a good challenge. I mean, I guess when I started, I was kind of a naive realist. I remember way back in the days thinking the light had the color red, and sitting in my first philosophy class and my professor saying no. And I was like, wait a minute, light is red, isn't it? So I do think that this is kind of the naive sort of view, but you can get argued out of it pretty quickly. But I wonder, so why couldn't the naive realist respond by simply biting the bullet and saying, look, the thing is, just like you can be aware of things that are spatially distant, you can be aware of things that are temporally distant. And so what's the challenge there?
I think that's perhaps one reason why it's not much discussed in literature, because the thought is, look, if you're worried about consciousness involving things in the spatio-temporal distance, why didn't you object earlier on when I said your consciousness involves the car? After all, the car is 10 yards away, and why don't you complain that how can your consciousness be? But in fact, in the case of the spatial separation from the fact observed, that doesn't seem so bad. And I think that the truth is that temporal distance is much worse for the naive realist than spatial difference, for the old-fashioned familiar reason that Descartes pointed out, that look, sensory experiences have a clear location in time. I mean, conscious states in general have a location in time. You know when they start and when they finish. As a location in space, that's a bit more mushy. I mean, Descartes didn't think that conscious things were really in space and space at all. And you might feel, look, there's nothing completely weird, or where is your conscious experience? And stretch out across to the car, that seems okay. But as you stretch back in time to before we naturally think of it as starting, that seems much more weird, just because we think we're pretty clear about where conscious experiences are located in time in a way which we aren't clear about where they're located in space. So the temporal extension looks to me much more worrying for the naive realist than the spatial one. We have definite views about where the experiences are located in time, and naive realism then seems to contradict those definite views. I mean, they could just bite the bullet, but it looks to be. I mean, here I don't like appealing to intuition, and I could suit this up into an argument, but let me just say, it just seems so odd to say that my experience started light years ago.
I mean, so I'm not, like I said, I was convinced of problems for naive realism
I
early
say
on, so I don't want to defend it
light
too
years of
much.
measurable distance. My experience started many, many years ago. Okay, go on.
So I don't want to defend naive realism too much, but is it really fair to say that the experience started thousands of years ago? The experience starts when the window is open, so to speak, on their view. So the properties are out there, the object's out there, and then you experience it when you have your receptivity sort of tuned to it. So the experience starts when you become aware of it. It just so happens a thing that you're aware of is temporally distant.
That's fine. I mean, I don't mind saying the thing you're aware of. If aware of just means the object, the thing that your sensory experience is related to is representing. I mean, sure. I mean, that's all fine. It's the further thought that thing is part of your sensory experience that I find difficult. And I find it difficult only because sensory experiences are conscious. So in the book, right. I say, look, I can have knowledge of the football match last night, and I only get the knowledge this morning, but the knowledge constitutively involves that football match. Knowledge is a relational state between me and a non-mental fact, and that's okay. And if somebody wants to say knowledge is a mental state, Tim Williamson wants to say knowledge is a mental state, various people worrying about skepticism want to say knowledge is a mental state, I don't mind that either. But what does seem to me odd is to say knowledge is a conscious mental state when it constitutively involves something that happened yesterday evening or when I was asleep and only came into my head, only came into my mind when I read the paper, and that it somehow constitutively involves this thing that was there and over before, as I think of it, my conscious mental state started. That seems all wrong.
Yeah.
Now, having said that, I mean, I'm just appealing to intuitions here. We might get onto it later, but I have an argument against representationalism, which finally cashes out in things to do with the causal role of conscious states. And I don't in the book, but if somebody wanted to press me very hard, I might start saying things about the causal role of mental states isn't consistent with the idea that they have these kind of long, distant, dangly, temporally extended bits.
Yeah, okay, so we are going to get into that later. But so I guess the only thing that I was reacting to was what you were saying just now before, that the conscious experience started well before, like, thousands of years ago. And I was just suggesting that doesn't seem fair to the naive realist to say that the experience started before you had the experience or something like that, but that the thing you're aware of started before you had the experience. So the thing that you're aware of is something temporally distant.
Their view is that the conscious experience is a compound thing. It's, as I said, it's a relation between me and the fact perceived, the fact observed, and it's a relation that's, here's me, there's the fact observed, there's a relation of me perceiving it, and it's that relational fact that constitutes my mental state.
Right.
And I mean, that's a much, I mean, that ties the observed fact into the conscious state much more tightly constitutively than your thought. Look, here's my mental state and here's the thing that it's about. I mean, I agree about that kind of talk, but that doesn't build the thing that's about into the mental state.
Right.
You're just thinking, here's another thing that's non-mental. There's nothing, I mean, my mental state could be there with that not there and vice versa. And but they're thinking of the observed fact as literally part of the mental state. And
yeah, and so I guess what you're saying is that if the thing that is there is part of my mental state, then it's the thing which is part of my mental state is something which no longer exists in a sense, or has ceased by the time I'm aware of it. It's gone.
Right, just put it like part of my mental state has ceased to exist at the time when I'm having the mental state. So I'm only having part of my
Yeah.
sensory experience now. I mean, that kind of looks wrong. I mean, that's what I'm saying is both. But look, let's not spend too much on this. This is just
No, I'm getting distracted. But one does wonder.
Page and a half in a 200-page book. But but it is curious to me that this issue gets so little discussed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the final thing I guess I would ask is, I wonder if relativity physics can help us, because I mean, one might just think this is, the speed of light being a constant just has one of its consequences is that things which are temporally distant from us can play these kinds of roles. And it does exist, and there's no real fact of the matter about, whether it exists or not.
So
from this point of view.
Yeah. There's a paper by Hanok Benyami at the CEU philosophy department, which he sent me. I'm not sure if it's out anywhere yet, where he does appeal to relativity, special relativity, to address this issue, and he says that that things that are separated from you the information comes to you at the speed of light aren't, according to special relativity, clearly in your past, and tries to get out of the problem like that.
Yeah.
And the things you observe through a vacuum, these astronomical events, they aren't clearly in the past. They're kind of on the edge of your light cone. So
I mean, most things.
Argument. I mean, I respond that, look, there's some things I'm not observing through a vacuum. They are in my past. I mean, I'm observing them through water or through air, or indeed through interstellar space, which isn't a perfect vacuum. So I'm not sure his argument applies, but it's an interesting argument. Yeah.
So I do wish there was more discussion of this, because I find it interesting. And one does sort of think that if one is a naive realist, then our physical theories are going to matter, because the world is supposed to be part of the mental state, so to speak. But I think the conclusive argument against, well, I don't know if conclusive, but the one that's convincing to me is the hallucinatory case. So in those cases, it certainly seems to me like there's something that's in common between the two things. They have to appeal to kind of disjunctivism. And really, this is kind of like a foreshadowing of your argument against representationalism, because what the naive realist has to say is that in the hallucinatory case, you're sort of aware of, uninstantiated universal properties. But the properties are of the objects in the world.
I'm not sure the naive realists say that. I mean, naive realists they don't want to. They tend to avoid giving a positive account of what's going on in hallucinatory cases, and some of them want to say nothing conscious is going on in hallucinatory cases. We kind of mistakenly think it is, but it's not really. I mean, their general line is that what's going on in hallucinatory cases, I mean, bad cases, maybe there's room to make the so-called illusory cases kind of a version of ridicule perception but in the bad full-on hallucinatory cases, there's no fact out there for you to be related to. And if it's your relation to the fact that constitutes the nature of their sensory experience, perception in the good cases, then something different has to be going on in the bad cases. It's just not like, I mean, it's a different kind of thing altogether. And William Fish pretty much argues that nothing conscious is going on. You're mistaken when you think. And that they want to avoid having anything too definite going on in the bad cases, because then it's not clear why the same thing wouldn't be going on in the good cases. Presumably your brain's in the same state, and that's going to make the same thing go in the good cases, and then it's not clear that this extra thing that involves the fact out there is going to do much work. But there's a lot of very fine-tuned debate around that, and I think the more basic issue for naive realism is just the thought whatever you say about what's going on in the bad cases, it's pretty weird to say that there's a conscious difference between the veridical cases and the hallucinatory cases, but introspecting from the inside, you can't notice the difference.
Right.
And I mean, I don't think that, there's anything kind of supremely authoritative or incorrigible about introspective access to your conscious states, but the idea of a conscious difference of a kind that nobody could ever discern by introspecting. Now I kind of feel I've lost my hold on what it is for a state to be conscious. So that's the basic worry about naive realism.
I wonder if do you know the work of Andrew Lee? Do you know him? He was a student at NYU, but now he's graduated.
I know Andrew Lee.
Yeah, because he argues for like what he calls the deep structure of conscious experiences, and it's sort of the thesis is exactly the thing that you're finding very odd. He thinks there's some theories of consciousness which are committed to it, like maybe some forms of panpsychism or something like that are committed to the idea that there are differences amongst conscious experiences that are not introspectable, and even ones that may turn out to be introspectively the same could be realized by different deep structures or something like that.
I'm just trying to remember. So I heard him give a talk at that Summer of Consciousness series. Were you there?
Yeah, I was there. That was on the value of consciousness. I think that was different topic. Right?
Wasn't about? I think I heard a talk by him along these lines, but it didn't especially strike me as something that the naive realists might appeal to preserve their view. But perhaps I just didn't put the two thoughts together.
Yeah, well, I don't know if it really would be friendly to the naive realist. My thought was just that maybe you could make a case for there being something like this not so strange, and then you could extend that to as a plank against your argument here that there could be non-noticeable differences, non-introspectable differences in conscious experience. Yes.
While we're on this, I mean, the way I argue, I mean, I do talk a bit in the book because there's a bit aspect of naive realism I find puzzling, because there's a possible position that says, look, when you're hallucinating, there is a kind of definite conscious feeling there, and presumably somebody who's really perceiving. Let's just posit that the veridical perceiver and hallucinator are intrinsically physically identical, right? So all that we do is we say we take away the car, right? You raise my brain, it's just like it is now, and now you take away the car, so I'm hallucinating, right?
Right.
And there's a natural line of thought. I think Howard Robinson perhaps is the person who first pushed this hard. It says, look, presumably what's going on in me consciously when I'm looking at when I'm hallucinating, well, the veridical perceiver by hypothesis has the same brain states. Presumably that same thing is going to be going on in them. Now, that doesn't necessarily knock out naive realism, because they might say, look, something else is going on in the veridical perceiver. The real car itself is going to add an extra kind of bit of oomph to their consciousness. Their consciousness is kind of got a vibrancy, a depth that's not there in the case of the hallucinator, which is due entirely to what's outside. And that seems to me a coherent position. I don't see why naive realists don't go along with that, but they tend not to like that at all. And the standard view is to block that line of thought, that you've got to recognize something consciously in common between the two cases, by saying, yeah, we don't like the idea that there's some definite kind of conscious state that's there in the hallucinator. We're going to block that. Either it's not conscious, or we can't really characterize it, or something, and we're going to block the idea as a definite conscious state in the hallucinator. When you say, but why are you so desperate to not have this kind of common state and then an extra thing in the good case? They say, because then the extra thing wouldn't be doing any work, right? You'd have this common conscious thing between the two, and you couldn't tell from the inside this extra thing was there. And my line of argument is, what do you mean you couldn't tell from the inside? That's supposed to be bad. You guys were saying they're conscious differences that you can't tell from the inside from the start. So I find the whole naive realist dialectic puzzling. I think they'd be better off just to stick with the idea there's some conscious differences you can't tell from the inside, and allow that in the good case, you have an extra vibrancy that adds to the conscious state that's common across the two cases. But for some reason, they seem not to like that. Maybe there's kind of epistemological issues that I'm not particularly attending to, that they're worrying about in that connection. But I don't know. Anyway.
Yeah. So, okay.
Let's move on.
Let's go to representationalism.
I'm much more interested in talking about representationalism, naive realism.
Yeah. Okay, let's do it then. Yeah, sorry, I got distracted by some of these issues. So let's move to the representational. And I wonder, in a way, representationalism is like almost a response to these kinds of worries, because they do want to say what the common factor is that you represent, the.
Look, so I have the fervor of the apostate here. I mean, I of course used to be a representationalist, aren't we all? Aren't we all representationists? I mean, I tell the story in the book about how the Chalmers and Bourget survey of 2009. I mean, I know I used to be a representationalist. It's on public record that I used to be a representationalist, because when they asked the question back then, are you a naive realist or a sense datum theorist, or I think they had Qualia theorist, or a representationalist? I thought, well, of course, I'm a representationalist. I'm actually a Qualia theorist, it turns out. But back then, I wasn't especially working on these issues. I hadn't especially thought about them very hard. And I thought, of course, sensory experiences are representations. That's pretty obvious, and I still think that. But, and so, I'm a representationalist about sensory experience. And certainly when I really got seriously interested in the philosophy of perception, that I realized I don't believe what the representationalists in the philosophy of perception believe at all. They have a much stronger view than just that sensory experiences are representations. They think their representational nature and their conscious nature are one and the same, tied together, the same thing. And it must be about the same time, because I can remember I was working on a paper I wrote, Phenomenal and Perceptual Concepts, 2007, all about phenomenal concepts. And I started thinking about perception a lot. And the more I started thinking about perception, I became convinced that obviously perception, in the terms of the trade, has singular contents. I can represent my wife in perception. And I mean, it was obvious. I mean, I wasn't thinking about philosophy of perception at all. I was just thinking about, what does perception do? What does perception represent? I thought it represents, among other things, particular objects. And then I had this niggling feeling, that doesn't fit together with representation is about conscious sensory experience, because what you're representing is supposed to go with what it's consciously like.
Right.
Couldn't I have a doppelganger who has a wife who looks just the same, and what it's consciously like for him is just what it's consciously like for me, but what he's representing is his wife, and what I'm representing is my wife? And that started to niggle away at me, and I realized I wasn't a representationalist at all, and representationalism was all wrong. And since I'd been kind of seduced into embarrassing myself by saying as a representationalist, I needed to put all that right. So that's what happened.
Well, you have a chance to redeem yourself, I guess. They're doing the next survey now. You could be getting an invitation if you haven't already.
No, I did it, and I think I could have said this. The question is much more complicated than your. Do people know how it goes? I mean, you're given free will, compatibilism, hard determinism, soft determinism, and one of the options is no. The question is much more complicated. I'm not going to choose between those three. But I think in connection with sensory experience, I just tick Qualia theorist this time around.
Wow. So because you could have had a case for the more complicated one, because you do agree that conscious sensory experiences have representational contents, just not essentially so. They have them contingently.
Right.
And so you could have said it's more complicated, like, you know, and made a case for your contingent case. But I think it's interesting because
maybe, but no, I think representationalism in the philosophy of perception is uncontentiously agreed on all sides by people who are working in this area, not people who are maybe observing by afar and don't know what the terms mean. But what the term means in this context is that the conscious character and the representational content are necessarily tied together.
Yeah.
And that's not something I think at all. So I mean, we should discuss maybe at this point, making clear what the issue is.
Yeah.
Issue is here. So yeah. So that look, so there's conscious character. There's what it's like. There's kind of feelings, consciousness, right? We know what we're talking about here. So and there's the specific what it's like properties, conscious properties you have when you're having sensory experience. It's like it is for you visually or orally or tactually when you're having sensory experience. So that's one thing. It's how it is for you consciously. And then there's another thing, which is how the sensory experience is representing the world typically beyond you. I mean, you can represent your feet and your temperature, and you can probably represent your mind, but mostly you represent things outside you, like the car and its color. And I think let's assume that representation is a matter of a state having a truth condition. It lays down a way that it's saying the world is. It's veridical, it's true if the condition obtains or not. I mean, my car is in front of me and it's gray. That's the representational content of my experience, and it's true if the car is there and is gray and is false otherwise. And I say, look, I mean, these are, on the face of it, these are two pretty different kinds of things. One's to do with how it feels, others to do with what is it saying about the world. And another question is, what, if anything, do these two features, two aspects of experience, their representational side and their phenomenal side, what do they have to do with each other? And now, I do think that the sensory experiences, and let's use sensory experience to refer specifically for the time being to the conscious side, I do think the instantiation of these conscious properties, my being in a conscious state, does represent features of the world. So the conscious state I'm in does represent that my car is gray. But now the question is, in virtue of what does it do that? And representationalists think either that it's part of the nature of representation that it feels like that, or it's a part of the nature, there's two kinds of representation. It's part of the nature of feeling like that it represents thus and so. And I think both those views are just wrong. I don't think it's representation is a funny kind of thing. And I guess what's driving a lot of my argument in the book is that I have a specific line on representation, but it's not peculiar to me. I'd say it's the kind of, I don't want to exaggerate. It isn't one of the questions in the Bourget-Chalmers survey. What do you think about representation? But anyway, here's a standard view. It's to do with tracking, right? It's to do with certain kinds of states typically are caused by or correlated with or guide an organism in accordance with a certain condition in the world. So there's kind of one state the representer, the other kind of state the represented, and they kind of go together in the normal run of things, and that's why the first represents the second. That's a pretty standard view, some kind of causal or teleosemantic or tracking account of representation. If you have that kind of account of representation, it's pretty clear that it's not going to be built into the representer that it goes with what it represents. It's not essential because this representer could have been correlated with something different. Or
right.
The same thing being represented could have been represented by some other different representer. And the analogy, obvious analogy is with words. I mean, words represent, all right. I mean, the word grey represents the color grey in English, but that word could have represented something different, or the color grey could have been represented by a different word in English. I mean, it's a contingent matter that we paired up that word with that color. And I want to say just the same about sensory experiences. Now, the analogy is not that tight, but evolution has geared us up. So this kind of conscious state goes with this kind of worldly property, and so far as the argument's gone so far, it looks just like words. We're kind of using this mental state to represent this external feature of the world. And given that's how I think about representation, then the idea that somehow it's built into the fact you're representing something, that it's going to feel a certain way, or conversely, it's built in the fact that it feels a certain way, you're going to be representing such and such a condition. Both of those thoughts seem just completely wrong. So that's right. So that's the basic attitude I have to representationalism in the philosophy of perception.
Yeah, so I guess there's a couple of things that I was wondering about when I was going through all this. So
Yeah.
One is that, well, there are tracking theorists who want to maintain this connection. So Ty and Dretske, for example, and I wonder what you think about their views. But then I also wonder about because you make this point in the book that it doesn't really depend on your theory of representation. You think the same's going to hold if you're kind of like a primitivist, I guess, like Adam Pouts, or a kind of non-physicalist like David Chalmers. And there I wasn't sure if the argument had the same sort of force. So I do wonder if part of it depends on like what kind of theory of representation that you're working with.
So just trying to think, is Adam's view representationalist? I think it is in my terms. He's just takes it to be a primitive fact that he doesn't give much of a story about it. Okay, there's cases and cases here. So Chalmers, I take to be what I call it. So where did we get to? Ask the question again, because you said that there's tracking theorists and then there's others.
Yeah, and well, so I had two kind of questions. One was the tracking theorists, they have they think these things do go together.
Right.
And I guess transparency is a big part of why they think that. So that's going to get us into
there's the transparency in a second, yeah.
Yeah, and then there's the other side, which is the kind of Chalmers style representationalism, which I think there's two parts to that. So one, and maybe this is two different topics, but I think they're both relevant. One is, are you a pluralist about representational contents? So I think Chalmers is, and he argues explicitly that you can have many kinds of content associated with the same state, broad, narrow, so forth, that both can be associated with the same representational state or whatever. That you attribute both contents to the same mental state. And so it seems like part of your argument assumes that you're going to only get one or the other of these. And then the other thing is, so if you take the kind of primitivist view, suppose, the Edenic version, you have primitive red, and it represents redness, the kind of perfect red or something like that. It's not instantiated in our world, but we know what our world would have to be like in order for it to be correct. And that's where you get this kind of representational content from.
Let's come to Chalmers and the Edenic properties later. Let me just think where to start here. So look, there's the two kinds of representationists, two kinds of people in this area who think that the conscious feelings and the truth conditions are essentially tied together. So, let me come back to the two. First, about pluralism, about content. Yeah, I'm not very moved by it. I think content is truth conditions. Okay, so there's Fregean contents. I think Fregean content is just a terrible idea. I say in the book, this is going to play no part in the book, and I hope the fact that I can discuss everything without bringing them in is part of an argument. I don't do it explicitly, showing that they're not needed. So broad and narrow contents. I don't want to say, no, we're not interested in that. That seems to me a perfectly reasonable move for representationists to say, look, there's these broad contents, I don't like them because that doesn't fit with representations. I'm going to stick to a certain kind of content, a narrow content. But the narrow contents need to be truth conditions. Otherwise, it's just, we're not talking about the same thing anymore. So, yeah, if you want to have, you're saying that sensory experiences only have narrow contents, that's fine. We can discuss that. I'm happy about that. They don't have broad contents. That's okay. I'm not ruling that out.
No, but what about how they have both?
No, it's fine. Okay. I mean, somebody who wants to say, I'm a representationalist about sensory experiences, but qua representationalist about sensory experiences, I'm only claiming that narrow contents are tied to the sensory experiences. But if you like, I'm open. I realize that there's another kind of content, broad content, that they also have, which aren't tied to the conscious sensory experiences.
Right.
That's a perfectly reasonable position, and we'll discuss that. I don't think that they can even make good the claim that narrow contents are essentially tied to the sensory experiences. So I mean, just put to one side that these other contents that they're not talking about. Let's talk about the contents they are talking about, and I don't think it's going to work.
So that's what that's where the Edenic properties kind of come in, because
let's leave Edenic properties for much later.
Okay.
So look, here's how I see it. There's these two kinds of representations. Those who start, they're naturalists, Gretzky, Tai, Lycan, Harman, maybe. They start with something like tracking theories of representation. And then they want to say, when you have a state, a mental state that's tracking P, that will determine the mental state to have a certain conscious character. Conscious character is tied to what it's tracking. That's one view. Then there's another view which says the direction of explanation goes the other way. When you have a conscious state of a certain kind, it kind of is determined by its being of that kind that it'll be tracking some P. No, so not that it'll be tracking something, it'll be representing some P. So the latter kind, let's call them the phenomenal intentionalists. This is after Uriah Kriegel's kind of written a manifesto for people of that inclination, the phenomenal intentionality research program. And they go from the structure of consciousness to conscious states that have a certain structure, thereby get to represent. The naturalists go the other way. They go from mental state is tracking some feature of the environment, and as a result, it will have a certain conscious nature. So they explain the conscious nature in terms of the representation, the other way around. Both positions tend to appeal to the same intuitive thought, and this is the transparency of experience. And I think, I mean, I don't want to go through that now, because let's move straight to the transparency experience. But I think that when you take away the appeal to the transparency experience, I think neither view has much mileage in it. I mean, the views kind of end up, we can come back to this, but they end up very implausible, not doing the job anymore if you take away the transparency experience. The transparency experience is this idea that when you introspect your conscious sensory experiences, you will notice that worldly properties like shape and color and size and tactile ones, texture, are present in your experience. So it goes back to a famous paper from Harman in the 80s. I can't even remember what the damn paper's called. And he says, I mean, no, here you are looking at a tree, introspect your experience of a tree. He's aiming to argue against the idea that experiences have properties separate from the properties of the things being observed.
Right.
And he says, introspect your experience of the tree, and I say you won't find any properties there in your experience other than the properties of the represented tree. Properties like brownness, branchy shape, fluttery leaves, and so on. Another famous paper by Horgan and Teenson in late 90s, I think, say, look, introspect your experience of the apple. There is the shape of the apple, the color of the apple, the feel in your experience. And right, so Harman, I think, is probably of the naturalist tracking theory representationalists. Horgan and Teenson are on the other side. They want to start with the structure question. But both of them take it that these worldly properties, yellowness, squareness, movement properties, are inside your experience and can be introspected. And then the natural thought is, well, if that's so, well, then of course the experiences are representational. I mean, it's not always spelled out, but it's not, you know, here I am, I got an experience, it's got square and red inside it, and so it's representing these properties to be instantiated in front of me. I've got an experience there, and the experience is red and square, and what the experience is therefore saying is that red and squareness are outside me. I mean, sometimes sometimes it'll get it right, sometimes it'll get it wrong, sometimes there won't be redness and squareness inside me, but either way, either case, the redness and squareness is in my experience, and that represents what's outside me. And that's the transparency idea which kind of drives representationalism. And we can come back and we could think about, would the truth tracking representationalists or the phenomenal intentionality representationalists have much of a position if they didn't embrace transparency? I don't think they would, but this is the idea that's common to them. And Chalmers is a kind of hyper version of that. So Chalmers thinks that the kinds of properties that are present in our experience are properties that, in fact, when we do a bit of science and visual science, really aren't there in the world. So we're now, you know, the property in our experience is a property, redness, which is the kind of property that would have to be an intrinsic surface property of an object to be instantiated. And there aren't any properties, so it's only in the kind of this Edenic world, beyond the mundane world, that these properties ever get instantiated. But still, they're present in our experience, and our experiences are thereby representing the world to
I mean, Dave does deny transparency, though. He doesn't really rely on the transparency arguments.
I don't know. Is that right? I mean, how would he know that? I mean, surely it's introspection that shows us that the properties our experiences representing the world to have are these Edenic properties.
Yeah, I think his view is that introspection, the most plausible way to interpret what's going on in introspection is that we're being presented with properties that seem to be
okay,
surfaces,
right.
but we can also introspect them as just phenomenal qualities.
Sure, but seem. So was the seam supposed to do some work there? I mean,
yeah.
That.
So I think he quibbles a little bit in one of his papers about whether this is an inference or whether it's in the phenomenology. I think he kind of goes back and forth.
No, but this is kind of a crucial point. I mean, if he said to me, "There's our experience," and when we introspect, we seem to be presented, and that just means that the experiences have a structure that makes it natural or intuitive to conclude that there are Edenic properties in there.
Yeah.
Leaving it open that there might not really be Edenic properties in there at all. I'm perfectly happy to agree about that. But I think Dave wants to go, but I think the seeming is supposed to be telling us something about what's really there in the phenomenology. Anyway, let's not worry about that too much. I mean, a lot of my positive view is conceding that experience is deceptive about its true metaphysical nature and putting that to one side. So
yeah. Well, I mean, because I want to go back to the first thing, but then since we're on this, I guess I'll just kind of finish up my previous thought, because suppose you accept that the properties are Edenic. Well, then you sort of get that they have representational content straight away, or that they're essentially associated with it, because the world would have to be a certain way for your experience to be veridical, to be accurate.
Yeah, but why are we
namely, it would have to have the Edenic property.
Why are we going to Edenic properties? I mean, so as I see it, everybody who appeals to transparency think there are some properties present in the experience, and the experience thereby represents the world before you to be instantiating those properties. And the charmer's Edenic properties is just a hyperversion of that. Now he's having that the properties in your experience are in fact ideal properties that are never instantiated in the actual world, but still, in virtue of those properties being present in your experience is representing them to be instantiated. So I'm happy to talk about all those views simultaneously. They're all ones that say the experiences get to be representational by incorporating the kind of properties that objects can, at least in the ideal Edenic world, have.
Right.
The experiences themselves have in them the kind of properties that, in fact, ordinary objects can or might themselves possess. So,
right. So I guess I see that as sort of slightly different from the transparency claim, but I take your point though.
Yeah, can I just? There's a hoovering noise in the background. Can you hear it?
Yeah, I do.
I'm going to ask them to stop. No, I can walk with this machine. Yeah.
It's okay. We can take a quick break. That's fine.
Okay, just give me 1 sec.
Yeah.
Rose. Hi. Richard, come back. I assume he's going to be back here in a minute. Coffee break.
Yeah, sorry. I thought it would take longer to get the hoovering done. Sorry about that. Okay, so my thought was that the argument that you have against representationalism is going to fare a little bit worse against the Chalmers style or Pout style representation, because the ultimate question that we started with was, what do the truth conditions have to do with the phenomenal feel? That was that's the puzzle. That's one of the main overarching themes of the argument that you're presenting, I think. And I think they have kind of a ready response there, which is that, well, the way the experience feels tells you under what conditions the world would have to, how it'd have to be. It'd have to be Edenic, in other words.
No, that's fine. That's fine. I don't think you should put Adam Pouts in that box, because look, the way the experience feels tells you how the world would be to satisfy the experience, to be as experience is representing it. So you can read the truth conditions off from the content.
Right.
All the representationists agree about that. The question now is, what is it about the conscious character experience, the phenomenal feel, that as it were fixes a truth condition? And I'm looking at the central bunch of people. I think of Adam as outside this, and various other people, but the central bunch of people who answer that by saying, the feel of the experience involves certain worldly properties, light squareness, grayness, and so on. Those worldly properties are there in the feel of the experience. And it's in virtue of that that the experience represents those self-same properties to be instantiated in the world. Now, Adam is a primitivist. He does not want to say that the worldly properties are in experience. Not surprisingly, because it's a very weird thing to say, and that's what we haven't come to yet.
Right. But I think that
all the people who say
agree.
All the people who say that the properties in the experience, I'm about to dump on, and we haven't got to that yet. And I'll simultaneously dump on Chalmers, who says, look, the properties in the experience, but they aren't ordinary worldly properties. They're these weird properties that would be instantiated in a world that was more ideal than our own world. But
yeah, so I think we disagree about how to interpret Adam. I mean, I'm gonna have him on next year, hopefully. He's got his book on perception, actually, that I've been reading as well. But anyway, so I think that what he has in common with the Chalmerses of the world, with Dave's view, is that what gives it, so what's in the experience is the redness, the primitive redness, and the world would have to instantiate that property if it were veridical, if the experience were veridical. And then we have independent reasons for thinking that there are no things in the world which instantiate that property. So we come to a kind of, but that's where the content, why it's representational, because what would make it, and the same would be true of the brain in the vat that you talk about. So the brain coalesces in the vat, and it's having the experience of the yellow ball, which, by the way, that's the only flaw in your book, is that you fundamentally misperceived what the whole debate is about. It's about red tomatoes, Dave. David, it's not about yellow balls. But anyway, so if it has this experience, then even that brain in the vat, the conditions under which that experience would be accurate are the Edenic ones.
Okay.
I don't see how you get out of that kind of argument.
Let's focus this issue. What I have against this whole range of positions, and we might see in a minute why Adam is not part of it, is that it makes no sense to say that these worldly properties are part of my experience. So let's just take a case, simple case, where I'm looking at a blue, well, let's make it more plausible, a green ball, and I see it as yellow. And now the story is that, well, my experience is representing the world to contain a yellow ball. It's representing it falsely, but right, the issue is, in virtue of what is it representing the world to contain a yellow ball? And the answer, the standard answer, without which representationalism really doesn't look very good, is it's doing that by, in virtue of the fact that the property of yellowness is there in your experience. The property of yellowness is there in your experience. Okay, and now I want to say, what? That makes no sense to me. And the line of argument is this. I understand what it is for a property to be present when it's instantiated. So properties are kind of, you can think of them in various ways, but let's keep it simple. They're, you know, things out there in Plato space, and then they come down into the world and become mundane by there being some object that's yellow. That's the simplest way for yellowness to get to be local, to be around here. But in this case, there isn't anything that's yellow. I mean, that's agreed on all sides. The ball isn't yellow. I said it's blue, or I said it's green. My brain's not yellow. My neural state isn't yellow. My experience isn't yellow. I'm not yellow. There's nothing's yellow. I mean, we're all agreed. And so people start saying, and you can find quite explicit quotes. So in this case, it's the uninstantiated property yellowness that's present in your experience. So now we've got a property which isn't local. It's somehow up in Plato's space or spread all around the world, but not here. And that thing is in your experience. And I say, I can't make any good sense of that. And I mean, there's a bit of rhetoric, and then there'll be an argument coming later. But I mean, I say that my experience is all here and now. And now there's some weird relation between my mind and this thing out in Plato's space, which isn't really part of the concrete world at all. And you're telling me that my conscious experience consists in a relation between me and this abstract property. I don't know what to make of that. So that's the basic objection, that something's gone wrong. I mean, it's very intuitive to say that yellowness is present in my experience. But if we look at that in the cold light of metaphysical day, we can't make any good sense of it. Something's gone wrong.
So I agree that that's an interesting argument against people like Lycan, I think, and other representationalists, maybe Dretsky and Tai. But I wonder, I'm not sure I see the force of it against people like Chalmers.
Okay.
And I would include Adam in this group as well. But we can disagree about that.
Well, you ask him, but if he was listening to what I just said,
yeah,
he would agree entirely, and he would say, because I've talked to him about this quite a lot. I corresponded. He would say, no, I do not think the yellowness is present in the experience. I don't think that at all. I think that it's a primitive fact that this mental state represents yellowness, but I'm not going to explain that in terms of the worldly property of yellowness being in the experience.
But the phenomenal property of yellowness is part of the experience. That's what the primitive fact is. Sure,
but that's a completely different property. I mean, if you mean by the phenomenal property of yellowness, the property that I have, or if you want to put it in those words that my I like to mean, some people talk about mental events having properties. I'd rather just talk about me having a property. I have a property when I have a conscious experience of a certain kind. And let's talk about the kind of conscious experience I have, which normally is produced by yellow balls and yellow lemons, right? And in that case, there's a certain conscious property, the property of you like, conscious yellowness, yellowness star, yellowness dash that I have, and that's a property, an experiential property, a conscious property. But that's not the same property as balls have when they're yellow.
Right.
The property I have when I'm looking at a yellow ball. And we want to distinguish between the yellowness of the ball and the conscious property I have.
Right.
Now,
but
Adam wants to say there's a primitive relation between, let's call it yellow star from now on, the conscious property I have when I'm looking at something else. It's a primitive connection between yellow star and yellow. And he just leaves it at that. It's primitive. The other people, and now I'm going to, the transparency people, and I think also charmers, want to say, oh no, I've got an explanation of why yellow star represents yellow. It's that part of yellow star is yellow. And when you introspect your yellow star property, you can see that it includes yellow. Harman says, introspect your sensory experience. And I assure you that the properties you see there will be the kind of properties that physical objects have, like yellowness, not yellowness, right. Yellow star, just straight up yellowness. I mean, a lot of very explicit quotes from many people in this business who are quite adamant that when you introspect your yellow star property, you find yellow there, ordinary yellow, but in many cases uninstantiated. And that's what I want to press on. How can it be there if it's uninstantiated?
I agree, that's a good challenge. But the only thing I'm sort of stuck on is whether this is accurate of the kind of Chalmers picture. Because so in the yellow star property,
Chalmers is like that, except he has
yellow star is Edenic yellow.
No, so he has part of yellow star is yellow E. Yellow E is for Edenic yellow, and yellow E I think of as akin to yellow. It's the kind of property that objects can have. Now he doesn't think any actual objects have it, but in a kind of this weird possible world in which objects have intrinsic surface properties, then they'd have it, right? So there's yellow E, which is kind of this ideal Edenic version of yellow. And he thinks yellow E is part of yellow star.
Right.
And that's why yellow star represents yellow E in the world beyond you. In his view, always mistakenly. But so I regard him as a variant of the people who think that yellow star involves ordinary yellow and thereby represents ordinary yellow in the world. And it's the idea that experience somehow involves there. I mean, there's all kinds of weird terminology. It includes there in your experience, you will observe, you can introspect, that there in your experience is yellow. Not yellow star, the conscious property that's peculiar to me when I'm looking at something yellow, but the very property that the object in the good cases have and the bad cases are represented to have, that property is in your experience. And
it's less puzzling though, right? If you so I mean, I get the force of what you're saying. I think it's a good challenge. I think it's interesting, but so
just to make it more, just drive it home.
Okay.
With yellow, it's kind of not so, because yellow's colors are funny properties, and maybe they're response-dependent properties, and maybe the property of being yellow really just is a matter. But we could run the whole story with square, right? Maybe the property of being yellow in the objects is just a property of being disposed to produce yellow star in people, or something like that. So the theorists of color get yellow and yellow star. Maybe they have some kind of complicated relationship. But square as a property of objects and the kind of property I have when I look at something square. Do we really want to say that the property of squareness is present in my, say when I'm hallucinating a square thing, there's nothing there at all. I'm just having, as it were, a visual image of a square thing. Is the property of squareness really around anywhere?
Yeah, I understand. There's no, That's the challenge. But so I guess there's two things going on here that I would want to try to tease apart. So one was responding to the kind of, so there's two challenges that you're presenting, I think. One is the one that we started with, which is, what does phenomenal feel have to do with truth conditions? So that's one challenge, is they seem like different properties. Then the other challenge is this one about uninstantiated properties being part of your, or worldly properties, sorry, being part of your experience. Those seem to me to be different challenges. And so the thing I was talking about was responding to the first challenge, that there's a answer that they have, that the Chalmers style representationalist has, to the question, why does the phenomenal feel and the truth conditions go together in this kind of necessary way? And really, I sort of see that, it would be the same for you with your qualitative view, if you consider the brain in the vat and shows up and has a yellow ball experience, then there's a way the world would have to be for that to be accurate, even if they're you're shaking your head, but I don't see why you get to shake your head. I guess it's sort of what I'm saying. But then there's the other challenge about the worldly properties being in your experience. And there, I think, again, you have this, if you have the Edenic stuff in mind, you have an answer, because the worldly properties, so when he says the worldly yellow is not in your experience, what he means is like the surface reflective thing. That's not in your experience. What's in your experience is the phenomenal property. And the phenomenal property is a representational property in the sense that it tells you what Eden would be like, or what our world would be like if it were Eden. So the two thoughts are kind of joined in that way.
Let's kind of try to keep track here. One issue is, what does the conscious feeling property have to do with the truth condition? The transparency stuff came in because that's how some people want to answer that first question. They say the conscious feeling stuff incorporates worldly properties. And that's why they lay down a truth condition. They lay down that those self-same worldly properties, which are in the experience, are being instantiated in the world beyond experience. So that's how the feel gets to represent. The feel involves worldly properties, which are thereby represented to be present beyond the experience. So I want to criticize that answer to the initial question, what does the feel have to do with the truth condition, on the grounds that it makes no sense to have these worldly properties as part of the experience. Now, you think it's better that Chalmers is not so directly in my line of fire, because his properties are Edenic properties, phenomenal properties.
Right.
Look.
That's why I said at the beginning of this that it sort of matters what your theory.
But Edenic properties, I understand them, are supposed to be properties that, in principle but not in practice, could be possessed by objects outside the mind. To that extent, it's not obvious why they're phenomenal properties. Phenomenal properties are properties that I have when I have conscious experiences. Chalmers thinks that they're phenomenal properties because he thinks the property I have when I have a conscious experience, yellow star or square star, is kind of a complex property involving an Edenic property being there.
Right.
And now I have just the same worry that I had about the more simple representationists who just had ordinary worldly properties in the experience. I don't see in what sense the feeling property I have when I have a sensory experience can possibly involve a relation between my mind and some further property, a property which in principle no in practice worldly objects could have. That's far too abstract a relation to constitute basically non-relational fact that I have a certain conscious feeling. Charles wants to say my having a conscious feeling is a matter of my mind being in a relation to never instantiated worldly property. And I say, no, hang on. My conscious experience is what makes me lift my arm when I want to reach something. How can a conscious experience, which has causes and effects that are local, involve some mental relation to this very abstract, this doubly abstract property? I mean,
Right.
I mean,
he has endorsed epiphenomenalism in one mood, so I guess that would be an answer to this. But also, Panpsychism might give you an answer.
That's fine. I mean, if my argument does hinge, I mean, my argument eventually. So, I mean, when people say, well, hang on, so what's so bad about the idea of a conscious property, in fact, being a relation to an abstract, currently uninstantiated property? What I say is, conscious properties are concrete local properties that have local causes and effects. And my eventual objection to the idea that they might be relations to uninstantiated abstract properties is that doesn't look like the kind of thing that can have local causes and effects.
Right.
If you then say, look, I'm happy to give up the claim that conscious properties have local effects, become an epiphenomenalist, in the book I actually say, well, okay, I've got no argument now.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to do that. I'm just saying that that's
except the epiphenomenalism is such an uncomfortable position.
Yes,
as we know, Jackson and Chalmers have both given it up because on close examination, it turns out to be a really.
Well, I don't think Dave has given it up. I just think that he is investigating other avenues which may let him out of it. But I don't think I think he still thinks it's an option.
Yeah, I think I can't remember. Does he have a view about the self-stultifying problem? I mean, in fact, his new meta problem of consciousness. Finally, he's got to the meta problem of consciousness after all. Is I think in his thinking quite largely motivated by the worry that that if dualism is true, it won't be part of our explanation for thinking that dualism is true, because it looks as if it'll have to be epiphenomenal and all these extra conscious facts are going to have no influence on what we write and say and in some sense think. I mean, it's a point he makes very beautifully and graphically in the original in The Conscious Mind, 1995. The zombie David Chalmers sitting at the word process, banging on for hours and hours about all these beautiful experiences he's having that can't possibly be physical.
I mean, maybe I see where we're getting on here. There's some other things I want to ask, but I just can't. So, I mean, part of this, I think, hinges on the way you think about the kind of representationalism involved. Because if you think of them as abstract objects, then yeah, of course you get this problem. If you think of them as phenomenal properties, then, so here's a different way to put the challenge. Why isn't it your own view a kind of representationalism in this sense? So you have the phenomenal property, the yellowness, the person has their modification of their, conscious experience, yellowly, or I know you're not adverbalist or whatever, but so you have the yellow phenomenal property.
Can you call it yellow star? Would you be happy calling it yellow star for the moment?
Yes. So you have yellow star.
Yeah.
And why isn't it just in virtue of the intrinsic nature of yellow star the case that if it were accurate, there would be Edenic yellow in the world?
I just want to be told what's the connection between yellow star and ordinary yellow, if you like, Edenic yellow. What's the connection? What's the connection? One's just a feely property. It feels like something to me. The other is a condition that the world might or might not satisfy. And how did you link them up? They're different properties. How did you link them up? That's all I want to know.
Yeah, but so that's it depends on how you. Can I just? It depends on how you define the Edenic properties, because the way they are defined is they're the properties the world would have if our experience, if the phenomenal property was like out there. So it's defined in terms of the phenomenal property being like out there. It's
but
perfectly
now,
red. The
when
surfaces
you
would be
say
perfectly red and yellow.
I think
So there's the
when you
connection.
say the phenomenal property needs to be out there, you're building more into phenomenal property than just how it is for me when I have the feeling, because that yet doesn't give us any clue about how that thing could be out there. That thing is a property of me. It's the kind of thing that can happen to me and other conscious beings. It's not the kind of thing that characterizes cars and objects and so on. The standard, the answer to what I've just said is then to say, part of the Feely property, part of the yellow star, somehow built into it is this other property, the kind of property that non-mental objects can have. And that's the bit where I say that doesn't make any sense. But
it might be the proto-phenomenal property, which is like the quality bit. So the whole idea of Edenic properties is that when you look at the yellow ball in Eden, the ball is perfectly yellow. And it's it has the kind of property that I have when I consciously have a yellow experience.
I don't understand that. You're not a ball, right?
No, I'm dense, but I'm not a ball. Paracha.
Right. So you can't have the Edenic property. You can't have the Edenic property. It has to be a physical object that has the Edenic property. I mean,
yeah, but I represent it.
Right. You represent it, but how? You have another property. How does it represent the first property? You don't have that property.
By being primitively yellow. That's what they have in common.
No. Okay. If you want to say there's two different properties, and so far I've said nothing about their connection, and it's a primitive fact that the one represents the other, I've got no further argument yet. I take to be Adam's view.
Yeah, that's not what I'm saying, though. What I'm saying is that
you're saying that somehow the properties are metaphysically intertwined. And I'm saying, I don't see how that can be. Tell me more. Because the first property is a property that physical objects can have. The second property is a property that you have when you're conscious, and at first pass, you aren't yellow, you aren't Edenic yellow, you just have the Feely property. And now I want to know, what does the Feely property have to do with the represented property? And you haven't told me yet.
I guess
perhaps we should move on. We've been going around this quite a lot.
But so before we do move on, can you tell me why isn't it, on your view, that when you have the yellow Feely part, why doesn't that put conditions on the world in the Edenic sense, that if you just read off the metaphysics of the world from your experience, then it would be that have that yellow property out there.
Okay.
That same property.
Let me try this. I mean, look, we've been going round and round, but I take it it's not hard to consider that evolution had wired us up differently. So the property in us, which actually represents the worldly property yellow, might have represented the worldly property blue.
Right, I agree.
And I take that to show that there's no built-in metaphysical connection between the property we have when we have a certain feeling, the feeling I have when I look at yellow balls, and the property that balls have when they're yellow. Because evolution could have just kept the same two properties and not have them representationally tied in the way they are.
Right, so, but then you would be still representing Edenic blue.
Okay, so that's an interesting question. I was about to say, I don't see why evolution shouldn't have wired us up. So on Chalmers' position, so the property in us that represents yellowness, in Chalmers' view, Edenic yellowness, in fact represented Edenic blueness. Why shouldn't evolution have done it the other way in that case too? And it seems to me just as much of a cogent supposition that it should have wired us differently with respect to those supposed representational facts. I don't see that bringing in the Edenic properties really helps. I mean, they're just more worldly properties. And
but they're defined in terms of matching, in terms of their phenomenal character or their qualitative character. So
I think you're equivocating. I mean, I think you're going back and forth between the represented property and the representing property. And
Because in Eden, they're the same.
what?
In Eden, they're the same.
I don't get it. In Eden, the representers are blue in the same way that balls are blue. Whenever they look
Eden, the objects have the properties that we naively take them to have when we have conscious experiences of blue. They really are perfectly blue. So here, what we do is we have the perfect blueness, but no physical object has that property. Thereby, we represent.
I think we've exhausted this bit, Richard. Let's move on. Let's move on. I give up.
But you haven't really answered the question that I was trying to ask you, which is why doesn't the brain in the vat, why doesn't it put a condition on the world, which is the following condition that
because none of its states are tracking anything in the world. They've never been linked up with anything in the world.
Yeah, but this isn't a tracking theory. Okay, let's move on. I agree. We'll have to attack this in a different way. So I want to go back to the thing which we put on the back burner way back when, and that was whether representationalism has any of the naturalistic variety has anything to recommend it if you take away transparency. And what I was thinking was that it does, because one of the kind of arguments that you typically find is that well, it would be nice if consciousness were like physically reducible in some sense, or made sense of in physical terms. And we have some theories of representation which are physically understandable. And so it would be nice if these properties turned out to be representational properties, because then we'd understand how they're physical. So isn't that a decent argument and would give it some interest even if you got rid of transparency?
Yeah. That would be great. But yeah. It would be nice if physical objects were just collections of sensations, because then we'd be able to know without any danger of skeptical error that they're cars and trees and so on. So I don't think you can defend a philosophical position just by pointing out that it has attractive consequences. You've got to show that it is supported by the facts as well. So, no, I agree. I mean, it'd be great if you would give a nice theory of consciousness in terms of representation understood naturalistically. Trouble is, if you put the transparency idea, the intuitive transparency idea to one side, and just leave yourself with the tracking, it has no plausibility whatsoever, the naturalist theory. So here's the view. So humans, other organisms have certain mental vehicles, let's think of as neural arrangements, and they get to represent features of the environment because they track those features of the environment. I mean, the way we've evolved and the environments we're in, I'm in a certain kind of neural arrangement. When there's something yellow outside, different neural arrangement when there's something blue outside, and so on. So far, so good. I mean, I'm all for that. It's a very good theory of representation. And now the claim is, you want to know why the neural state lights up the way it does when it does in consciousness? It's because of what it's tracking.
Right.
It's because it's tracking blue that it feels like this. And I say, hang on, you mean that if that same neural state had been tracking something different, it would feel different? And if blue had been tracked by a different neural state, that other neural state would feel the same? And that just looks kind of, with nothing more to be said, completely implausible. I mean, we can build it up into an argument, but you see, it's not an attractive position. That what it feels like doesn't depend on the neural arrangements inside your head, but what the neural arrangements have to be tracking. With the consequence, and this is, I mean, you can do Ned Block's inverted Earth, or you could imagine evolution wiring us up differently. With the consequence, if that same neural state had been tracking something different, it would feel different. That doesn't look very plausible consequence.
Right. So people like Ty have tried to argue that if you have like some kind of, history built in here, you can deal with the twin inverted Earth cases, but it still doesn't seem very plausible that, so suppose you have something that has the function of representing blue objects, and then you go to twin Earth. So that, your biological ancestry is going to be wired up in such a way to be in tune with blueness on this planet, not inverted Earth. And so it doesn't come to represent blueness on inverted Earth. I take it as really what the response there is, contrary to what the thought experiment is supposed to get us to. But that is,
so this is the classic case. So Michael has somebody who, this is standard, somebody who's so there's inverted Earth where the sky is yellow and the daffodils are blue, and then one day you're kidnapped. Yeah. And you have inverted lenses stuck into your eyes, and you're taken off to inverted Earth, and you wake up, you don't see any difference. And in that case, I think Michael gets to argue that even in the new environment, you were designed to represent the old thing, and so you don't change the representation. But then he has to deal with a swamp man, so he has a swamp man who gets kidnapped and has inverted lenses. And I can't remember how the argument goes there. But Michael is prepared to bite the bullet.
Yeah.
Michael, when push comes to shove, and in that paper he does at one point say, I don't see why I shouldn't say that even though everything inside your skin is just the same, it will feel different because you're tracking something different. And then he says, well, I wouldn't give up if I had to say that. I can see a way out of having to say that. And then he gives you that. But so, yeah. Michael's going to follow the argument where it goes, and he doesn't worry too much.
Exactly. Yeah, so I agree with you that this is a good challenge.
That's how to do philosophy. But
suppose that we granted your arguments here, because I do find that it's a forceful consideration. So where does that leave us? Now, I know that it leaves us with your qualitative view. I mean, we don't want to be sense data theorists. I that has a bad rep, and all these weird objects out there. But so can you tell us a little bit about what your positive view is, I guess, for at this point?
Yeah, and so it's a bit odd. I mean, I'm going to say, look, here's this radical positivist. I mean, positive view. Scarcely anybody else in the business thinks anything like this. But in fact, the view I'm going to explain now is probably the view that most intelligent high school kids who worry about this kind of thing have, and most scientists have, and probably most philosophers in our tradition until the last 150 years. And I don't know what's happened to the philosophy of perception. It's this little kind of niche area where people have these strange views. So my view is kind of, I think of as the informed common sense view. So which is, look, we have these conscious states, these conscious properties we instantiate when we have sensory experience, and they have no essential connection to the world beyond. They're like words in the language of thought. They're lit up with consciousness, but they're still so far just meaningless words in the language of thought. They get to have the representational. They're not world involving. They don't involve facts beyond the mind, nor even do they involve properties beyond the mind. So that's the crucial thing. They're qualitative. They're not. They don't have built-in a link to the world beyond. And then they're linked to the world beyond just because of the way we've evolved. We've been embedded in a wider environment. So there are these real links, but they aren't there inside the conscious states. So the conscious states are a bit like, I don't want to put it like this because I don't think of this as in mattering for epistemology, but they're like a veil in between us and the world beyond. When we introspect our conscious states, we aren't at that point learning anything about the nature of the world beyond. So it's a bit like the sense datum theory or some way of ideas in the 17th century. I mean, we have these ideas in our mind and they aren't intrinsically tied to what's beyond the mind. I don't think of them as non-physical objects, as in the sense datum theory, and there's what's the other big difference between my view and the sense datum theory? We aren't aware of them. We don't focus our minds on them when we have sensory experience. They're the states in virtue of which we know about other things, not things that we know about in the first instance.
But even your view of introspection is that you don't directly access them. You sort of come to learn about them by what kind of beliefs you would tend to have or something. So it seems like they're always outside of our focus.
Yeah, well, I mean, the introspection thing is interesting. That's another thing people don't talk about very much in philosophy. And pretty much everybody assumes that you can, when you have a conscious mental state, especially sensory experiences, you know what sensory experiences you're having. So you are aware in the sense, not just that it's conscious, but you have a belief that I am now having a sensory experience of a grey car. But nobody thinks very hard about what's the process that takes you from the sensory experience to the belief that you're having such a sensory experience. I have a rather creaky looking theory, but I don't feel too apologetic about it because some theory is needed and nobody is offering pretty much any theory. Now there's something else I have to do. I have to go and get my charger. No, I don't. It's here. It's here.
Well, I just got vertigo there. It got spun around really quickly.
My computer is running out of juice. So a lot of the second half of the book, though, is recognizing that sensory experience does have a very rich structure.
Right.
With all kinds of invariances and constancies, due, of course, to the way that the world is causing our experiences, and that this makes it very natural to think of it as intrinsically involving things beyond the mind. And I look at various aspects of this invitation to think of experience as somehow stretching us beyond the mind, allowing us to get out into the external world and show how we can account for this appearance of mind independence without conceding that experience really is mind independent. So that's a lot of what's going on in the second half of the book.
Yeah, and that I had a lot of so I have a lot of questions about that stuff. But one of the things obviously is that you have some affinities with like the view of Ned, someone like Ned Block and his mental paint, mental oil, latex, whatever you want to call it. Yeah. But there's one interesting, the way you distinguish yourself from it, I thought was quite interesting. And so I wanted to ask you about this because what you end up saying there is, look, on Ned's view, there are mental paint properties, mental oil properties, but there are also representational properties, which figure in the what it's like bit. They change or determine they have an effect on what it's like. And it seemed to me like you wanted to deny that representational properties don't show up in what it's like for us. And I'm a bit confused about why you think that. So I wonder if you could say something.
I actually think that Ned thinks what I think.
Okay.
But that's not how he puts it, never has put it, and he's kind of not really working on this so much anymore. So the real difference is that Ned and I probably think about representation differently. See, I think of representation as some kind of tracking theory. There are things inside the head that are correlated with things outside the head. Now, Ned's an old style, I don't know, advertisements for a conceptual role. No, perhaps that's not him, but conceptual role semantics, inferential role semantics. He thinks that an awful lot of what is worth calling representation is to do with inferential connections inside the head.
Right.
And so he's interested, and he always has been, in how much of consciousness can be accounted for by the fact that certain mental items have inferential connections with each other and how much can't. And he's long wanted to argue that there's some aspects of our sensory consciousness that really can't be equated with inferential connections between the items inside the head, in particular, color experiences. And this is to do with the difference between red and green not being functionalizable.
Right.
Even if you swap them around, all the other connections could just stay the same. So he thinks the phenomenal character red and green is something extra to the inferential functional roles of these mental states. And then he's inclined to think of representation that's to do with inferential functional roles. So he wants to say, in addition to the representational stuff, i.e. all the functionalizable stuff, there's extra qualia, mental paint. Now, from my point of view, all that functionalizable stuff, that's not really representation. That's more internal stuff. So from my point of view, it's more paint. If paint means not representational properties, then it's, I'm quite happy to say my view is a pure paint view. It's all paint. All the features of conscious sensory experience are paint features that aren't essentially representational. But as I said, I think Ned actually thinks just what I think. It's just that he's thinking of representation differently from me. He's thinking of representational in terms of mental states that are exhausted by their internal causal connections, whereas I'm thinking of representation as a matter of relation between what's inside the head and what's outside the head.
Right. So maybe I was, yeah, I guess the issue that I was asking about just now was whether, well, I'm getting distracted by the functional and representational stuff. So I'll put a pin and come back to that.
That's not a whole bit of history. It's not
yeah, I know.
Faded away a bit.
But suppose that you have so the question that I wanted to ask at the beginning was, suppose you just have a conscious experience of yellow star. Suppose you just have yellow star. And then yellow star comes to represent, because of embedding and all the stories that we want to tell, whatever, if it's information, whatever your theory of representation is, suppose it comes to have a representational content associated with it.
Yeah.
Does it change what it's like to have yellow star on your view?
No.
Yeah. So that's what so it seems like it should have some influence on it, because now it seems like it's tracking something, right? Now it seems like the world's out, getting involved somehow, right? Doesn't that make it into the phenomenal character or phenomenology on your view?
It would be intuitive. I mean, I put to you that what it's like depends on what's going on inside your skin, and that can stay the same. Yellow star is going on inside your skin, but what it's tracking outside you might be different. But what it's tracking outside you isn't going to make any difference to what's going on inside your skin. Now, I mean, in the book, I don't especially commit myself to that line of thought, because I'm open to the idea that what it's like if you can depend on matters outside your skin.
Right.
I don't think, though, what it's like is going to depend on what you're tracking. That's kind of too distant for it to be plausible. But that's fine tuning. I mean, you think it's kind of obvious that it will feel different when it's tracking something different? I say it's pretty obvious that it won't. What it feels like depends on the neural arrangements and not what the neural arrangements are tracking.
I was saying that I think it's obvious that when it comes to track something, it'll feel different than when it tracked nothing.
Ah. I think to that thought, I'd say just the same thing as I just said. Whether it's tracking something or not is to do with what's outside the skin, shouldn't make any difference to the consciousness. But there is a line of thought. I don't think I have it in the book at all. But that it might make a difference to how it feels if, so to speak, you take it to be tracking something internally. And I mean, Causality with her stuff about constructing a world for the senses. I mean, the sensory experience has a very rich structure, invites you to think of it as to do with the external world.
Yeah.
And there's another thought that, and that you treat it like this, it guides your behavior. So when you come to see, I don't know, when your sensory experience comes to have, and I speak loosely and metaphorically, a depth, a three-dimensional character, it starts to guide your actions, how far out you reach.
Right.
Compared with this just kind of flat two-dimensional kind of thing. That will have, I mean, she talks about Gestalt switches in that context. That looks like it plausibly will have a different conscious character. And I'm open to the idea that that the way the experiences link up with dispositions to action will make a difference to the conscious character. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I do think that shape experience, experience of things in geometrical space, is functionalizable. It is. Does it look? It looks like the feeling is all to do with how the experiences of squares relate to experiences of rectangles and circles, and how it inclines you to move your hands, and that's all going to plausibly vary with the conscious feelings you have when you have those experiences.
Right.
But that's all about stuff going on inside the head. And it's not yet anything to do with what's actually the relation between what's inside the head and what's outside the head. And I think of representation as to do entirely with the latter. I mean,
right.
If you want to think of representation in the kind of old-fashioned conceptual role, inferential role, functionalist way, then sure, representation like that, internal structure will affect the conscious feelings. Yeah, sure, of course.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Good. Because that, I mean, this is part of my general theme, which I've been thinking about this stuff, is that a lot of the argument depends on this conception of representation that you have in mind. Yeah. So it's not just like representation generally, but really the thesis is any kind of tracking representationalism is going to have these sorts of issues, but maybe there's other kinds of representationalism that don't.
Okay, so let me just say a little bit about people we haven't talked about in the phenomenal intentionality research program. So, I mean, let me think. Uriah Kriegel, I very much have in mind. Angela Mendelevici. Not so much David Bourget, who she writes with quite a lot. Kotifarkas sometimes. Okay, these are people who are not keen on the transparency and don't think the worldly properties are in the experience. So Angela's explicit about that. Uriah, they don't like it, doesn't make sense. Veil of abstractor, Uriah, he
calls a closer of the concrete.
Exactly. Yeah. That was the phrase I was looking for. So they want to stand off the idea that you can explain why these conscious feelings represent stuff outside via saying the properties represented are actually in the experience. But then they're stuck a bit without an account of why the stuff inside feeling like that should be representing anything particular outside. And to be honest, some of them stop saying that it does. So Angela, in her book, at the end is quite insistent that she has a non-relational account of intentionality. The intentionality she's talking about does not carry with it essentially truth conditions. And Uriah, I don't think has come out very clearly, but he kind of gets to this issue kind of down the end of some footnote in a paper and says something not very satisfactory. So, I mean, for them, the aim is not so much to show how the structure of consciousness lays claim to truth conditions outside. It's just to explore the structure of consciousness itself. And if they want to say that's intentionality, it's got a structure which seduces you into thinking that it's about something else. It's kind of pointing to something, and that's all intentionality is. Sure, okay, then sensory consciousness is intrinsically intentional. But that's not the kind of representation I think of as real representation, which is having a truth condition standardly for conditions beyond the mind.
Right. Yeah. I mean, because this takes us to some things you say about like quasi-objects and how you don't want to identify these with intentional objects. But one could take like the quasi-objects to be intentional in one sense, in the sense you just mentioned, namely they sort of seduce you into thinking that they're about things external to you.
Right.
And if that's all you mean by it, that's fine. But if you mean by representation, they're going to represent something different in a different environment, that's where you're going to draw the line and say, well, look, they're still going to be the same arrangement of quasi-objects. And if you're in an environment where worldly blue is different, then there's still going to be that qualitative thing in your quasi-object. That doesn't change because the environment changes. That's really the pivot point.
So how did you like the stuff about, so I quote Brian Law. Brian Law is sadly...
Yeah, you quote him twice.
The same passage twice, exactly.
Yeah.
So we all miss him, and I think this is probably his last paper, and it's wonderful paper, and he says, look, here in your experience, introspect your experience. There in your experience is the yellow lemon. It's there in your experience, and he has this passage where he says, look, and it grabs you, and you think, there it is. I've got that there, and at the same time, you think it might or might not exist. Right. So that thing, the yellow thingy in your experience, might be a real lemon, or it might not exist. And that passage, he's just kind of using that to try to get across what he means by the intentionality of the experience. And I love that passage because it's quite right. I mean, that's how you think. There's this thing, and it might not exist. It's kind of pointing to its own. But I don't think he takes that passage, I mean, what's being said in that passage very seriously. And as I point out, there's something deeply incoherent here.
Right.
Because there's this thing in your experience, and as a thing in your experience, it exists for sure. Even if you're hallucinating, the yellow lemon in your experience is there. And yet at the same time, it's something that might or might not exist. There's a kind of obvious incoherence there, that something which definitely exists might or might not exist.
Yeah.
And it's a very natural way to think, and something's gone badly wrong. So how did you like that stuff about the intentional objects and the quasi-objects? That's what kind of took the most work in the book, I think. It took me a long time to come to terms with what I wanted to say about intentional objects, which is something that's thrown around by representationalists quite a
bit, actually. Yeah, exactly.
And I mean, Harman says, well, we've got to have a theory of intentional objects sometime. I don't have any good one here, but look, it's the tree qua-intentional object that has the tree properties and so on in your experience. I mean, that's brought in to explain how the tree properties can be there even when you're hallucinating. It's because they're presented by the intentional object of your experience, which in this case is the real object. And it's all bad.
Yeah, no, the tension is real. I think it's a good point that you can't say that thing may or may not exist because it's there. What you mean is that the physical lemon may or may not exist. That's clearly what you have to mean.
Right.
But and that sort of doesn't get you what you wanted from the passage, though. Once you disambiguate that. Yeah. I agree, but so one natural thought is, well, okay, I mean, so this is kind of, you just said this. So, but let me back up. So it's not really the case on your view that the yellow lemon is in your experience. There's a quasi object there, which has yellow star and maybe round star. But those things only contingently represent yellow and round, and much less lemon. I assume, although this is something that comes up at the end of your book, you're saying, well, hey, I could have extremely rich properties in perception, and who cares?
I've got nothing against representing lemon, because for me, representation is tracking. It's tracking.
Right. So you could be representing lemon, but those things are all contingent properties of the yellow star, round star, quasi object.
Right.
And there is a sense, of course, in which the objects that they are tracking may or may not be there. So why couldn't you call it like a quasi-intentional object? What's wrong with that line of thought? If you say that, look, what it represents may not exist, and it has its representational content contingently, but it's still all the other things that we were just talking about kind of go through if you retranslate it, right?
So I don't want to call the element of my experience an intentional object, because intentional objects, by their nature, are supposed to be things that sometimes don't exist. There's the mental state. It has the intentional object, and when it's working as hoped, the intentional object will exist. I'm thinking about my next meal, but if there ain't never any next meal, then my thought merely has an intentional object. So sometimes it exists, sometimes it doesn't exist. But the yellow lemon in my experience, no way that doesn't exist. So I mean, I'm happy to I mean, you can call it what you like, but the kind of intentional objects that people thinking about the semantics and metaphysical commitments of representational mental states are talking about, they're things that might or might not exist. Sometimes they exist.
But so that was exactly my kind of thought, though, was that there is a sense in which it might not exist because it might not have those representational properties, in which case there is no yellow lemon in your experience. There's just these yellow star, round star properties.
No, I was talking about the thing with the yellow star, round star properties so you weren't suggesting that that's an intentional object.
No, I was suggesting the intentional object is the yellow star, round star representing lemon.
No, so here's my experience. And it's kind of, I mean, I move around, it has various constants. There's this thing you can track through time in the experience, which is kind of, let's be crude, the image of the lemon or something like that. I mean, okay, and I might or might not be hallucinating. So for sure, there's this thing in my experience, the image of the lemon, and that, I want to say, doesn't really have the properties yellow or round. It has yellow star and round star, and then there's a real lemon out there that might or might not exist. And so I don't want to call it, I mean, I don't really believe in intentional object. I don't want to call either of them an intentional object, but
I guess this kind of gets to a question I've been having in the back of my mind the whole time. So suppose that you are a swamp, a Boltzmann brain, a swamp brain.
Yeah.
You pop into existence with the yellow star, round star properties. You're not hallucinating, are you?
Yeah, okay. So
you're only hallucinating when you have the representational content.
Do you want me to argue? I mean, I look, as it happens, I think that Swamp Man isn't representing anything because of a particular version of a tracking theory of representation.
Exactly.
But that's not especially prominent in the story I'm telling in this book. So I could respond to your question on the assumption that Swamp Man is representing. But shall we have him not representing? Shall we? I mean, let's make him a.
I mean, on your view, the qualitative view, the view that you want to endorse for the metaphysics of sensory experience, Swamp Man doesn't represent the yellow lemon, and therefore isn't hallucinating.
That's because I want the tracking to be tracking by design, and so he's not representing. But
right.
But most people intuitively think that Swamp Man is representing. But still, let's assume he doesn't represent, or to make it more plausible, let's have a cosmic Swamp Man out in interstellar space.
Exactly.
Right? Okay. Where I switched that case because more people will find it intuitive that being is not representing anything.
Right.
So that being has a yellow, a lemony experience. Okay. And now your question is?
Is it hallucinating? Because it seems like I thought the answer was no.
I mean, nobody's ever asked me that question. I never put my mind to it. My first reaction is no. To be hallucinating, you've got to be representing falsely, badly falsely. I mean, your referring term doesn't even succeed in picking anything out.
Right. So that's what I thought you were going to say.
The swamp brain. He ain't got no referring terms. She ain't got no referring terms.
So then the question I was asking before was that the cosmic swamp brain doesn't have a hallucination, so therefore no intentional object. But if you're hallucinating, there is an intentional object. It's the representational content that experience has.
Let me see. I'm not very keen on intentional objects. Thought of as involving things that don't exist people who trade intentional objects, who are the paradigms? Bill
Brentano, obviously, but
Tim Craig want to go with the natural way of talking that here's this guy and he believes that King Arthur ruled Wales, and in fact, let's suppose there's no King Arthur. So King Arthur doesn't exist, right? So, and now we say naturally he's thinking about somebody who doesn't exist. I mean, that's what we all say,
right?
And some people thinking about what's being said here and the semantics, and want to say, look, there are things that don't exist. I mean, as shown by some people think about them. So I'm not sure I want to go there. I don't think I need to bring in these things that don't exist. I just want to say,
yeah, because you were just asking about the identification of the quasi-object with the intentional object,
right?
And so I was thinking that there's a way you could do that if you wanted to identify the intentional object with the representational content of the quasi-object.
So let's go. So in the book, I say, look, the thing I just said, I don't really like intentional objects. I don't need them. I put that to one side. I say, look, let's suppose that you did think it was good to think that there's something that the person seeing pink rats is seeing.
Right.
Suppose you did think that, you still wouldn't be able to get to representationalism in the way that law suggests you might, by identifying the quasi-objects with the intentional objects, because they're different kinds of things. The quasi-object, the feature of your experience, definitely exists. Intentional object might or might not exist. Now, with the cosmic swamp brain, I don't think the question of intentional objects comes up, because I don't think there's any representing going on.
Right.
There's there's some conscious states, just like the conscious states we have when we have sensory experience, and they've got a certain structure. And in there will be, a yellow star, blobby star kind of thing. But there's no question about whether the intentional object of that experience exists or not, because it's not representing anything.
Right, exactly. That was kind of my point.
Yeah.
But in your case, there is. It's whether the representational content is satisfied or something like that, whether the world is as represented. And that's a feature of the quasi-object with, for you. That's a feature of the quasi-objects with representational content. And if you wanted to look for something that was the intentional object, it would involve that, the representational content. Those properties.
Yes, and the thought there is that with me, who really is representing, albeit only contingently given my conscious state, and if we go along with this talk of intentional objects, so there's my sensory experience, and it has its intentional object, a non-mental lemon.
Right.
And in the good case, that intentional object really exists. It's the real lemon out there, the thing you can squeeze and so on. And in the bad case, I was thinking about something, intentional object, that doesn't exist. That's what these people want to say.
Right.
But in neither case does it make sense to equate the intentional object with the yellow star, blobby star feature of my experience. That
I agree.
With the representation. So that's where we got to.
But might you equate it with the representational content of that quasi-object?
Sure. I think so.
Yeah, that's all I was asking.
Yeah. There's another whole issue here, which you're now alluding to. I don't really want to go there, which is in the case of full-on hallucination, what is the truth condition? That thing is yellow when there ain't no that thing. And so there's all kinds of moves here. And I guess I have that issue as much as anybody. And I think I would now speak with Michael Tyne. I think in that case, the sensory experience doesn't actually succeed in securing the truth condition. It only has what in the present context is confusingly caused by David Kaplan a character, i.e. it has half a representation, which if it got together with some particular object would form a truth condition.
Interesting. So it doesn't really have representational content.
A gappy content. So hallucination.
Gappy content.
Hallucinations do not have truth conditions for me, I'm afraid.
Interesting. And if you tie representation itself to having a truth condition, then it looks like there's a tension here.
There's a bit of a tension, but in fact, I do say when I talk about gappy contents not being truth conditions, say at least there's an intrinsic connection. Okay, for Ty, there's an intrinsic connection between an element of experience and a worldly property. For me, there's a contingent connection between an element of the experience and a worldly property. But this state has failed to secure a truth condition because it's failed to secure a particular referent in kind of subject position. Because I don't want to go, I certainly don't want to go the way of saying what all I'm representing is that there is a object that's a lemon and yellow or anything like that.
Existential conditions.
Try and get some general non-singular content. I want sensory experiences to have singular contents, all right?
Yeah. Okay. Well, we've been going on forever here, and
we can stop. Okay,
well, I have one more thing that I have one more question that I want to ask you, if you'll allow me. If you have to go, then I understand.
I'm happy to go on. I'm just worrying about your viewers. How long are they prepared to go on?
Well, they have the option of pausing and coming back later, so they can. I don't worry about them. Well, they can put it on twice the speed, actually, which is how I listen to these things. But anyway, so I want to ask about the neural realization of these properties, and maybe connect this up with something which you were going on about on Twitter a couple of times, and you've been accused of being a kind of materialist panpsychist, and I don't think that's an accurate characterization of your view. So I want to ask about these qualitative properties, which modifying a subject, I like all that, but they're still going to have neural realizations, right? And maybe you'll be something like an identity theorist with respect to these qualitative, in some cases, like the yellowness, I don't know, maybe even if they're functionalizable, they're still going to have neural realizations. Yeah. So, and I know you're attracted to the phenomenal concept strategy, right? You have a pivotal role in helping that become an important topic. So Mike, I wonder how you respond generally to this, the kind of challenge about how like brain states can have these qualitative properties. How something which is not intrinsic, I mean, there are no intrinsic properties of brain states as far as that matter in this respect, but yet these are supposed to be intrinsic properties. So I'm just wondering, how do these things get realized in brains, I guess is what I'm fumbling towards.
So simplest would be if I just simple identity theorist. So, I mean, you know, I could go functionalist and grounding and so on, but first pass, I'll just say that having a conscious, I mean, okay, I'm going to say it and then I'm going to take it back. So having a conscious is one and the same as having certain neural arrangements. If you have those neural arrangements, you have the conscious property. It's not, you know, God couldn't give you the neural arrangements without giving you the conscious property. There's nothing more involved in the conscious property having those neural arrangements. In fact, they're one and the same thing. That's what it's like for you when you have those neural arrangements. So I'll just be a full-on hardline identity theorist. The two properties are just the same properties, differently described. Having said that, physicalism does not play any role in this book, I don't think.
Right.
All arguments go just the same if you were a dualist, that you thought that consciousness involves some special Cartesian mind stuff. There'd still be a question about what does that Cartesian mind stuff properties have to do with representational properties. But if you want to know what I think, so I certainly think there's very intrinsic connections between conscious properties and neural properties. It's just that neither of them, I mean, they aren't them. It doesn't have any intrinsic connections with representation.
Right, but so there is a yellow star property, which is a certain brain state. And the yellow star property is has an intrinsic qualitative aspect to it. But the brain state, it doesn't seem like there are any intrinsic properties that it has that can play this.
I think you just have to count the ontology carefully. So I don't want to think of brain states as things that have further properties. I think of states as a matter already of things of having properties. So I would say, look, there's me, right? I'm the subject of all these properties, and I have a conscious property, and that's intrinsic to me. It doesn't involve my relations to any other things. And I have a neural property. There's me and there's the neural property, also intrinsic, doesn't roll. And the conscious property and neural property are the same property. And they're both intrinsic to me.
Right.
That's how I think about it.
I mean, don't get me wrong. I am an identity theorist, so I like this line of thought, but I guess I don't understand the intrinsic part. So which properties of the brain state are not relational?
So look, there's a brain state which consists of me having a brain property, a neural property. So there's me, and I have the property of my prefrontal cortex is wired up so and so. Okay, and that's intrinsic to me. My having that property doesn't depend on any other objects in the universe having any properties or not. Now, you might be thinking, hang on, the neural property itself,
yeah,
the complex property, which as it were inside it involves other objects having, you know, all the neurons having relations to other neurons, right?
Exactly, yeah.
So I don't know. I don't know what I think about complex properties. I don't know what I think about how to define intrinsicness in such a way as I said it's intrinsic if it depends just on how it is with me and not on other objects having certain properties. But now you say, hang on, it depends on the objects inside your brain having certain properties. And I don't want that to disqualify the probably be intrinsic because those neurons are inside my head. But I don't have any clear views on complex properties, and I don't have any clear views about how to develop the notion of intrinsicness to accommodate these complications.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. And so, I mean, this might be one of the reasons that pushes people towards representationalism in some sense, because there, if you don't have the intrinsic properties, it's easier to understand how the brain has representational properties. I mean, that's a lot less demanding. I mean, there are challenges, but it's a lot less demanding to understand how the brain comes to track, carry information about, causally covary with, et cetera, properties in the world. So
you're thinking that because the neural properties are structural, functional, and to that extent not just intrinsic,
right?
That makes it easier to see how they might be representational, perhaps essentially representational. My response is not really. I mean, the structure, functional relations are all inside the head, and representation is to do with relation between what's inside the head and what's outside the head. And so having this extra complexity inside the head isn't really helping. I mean, that's my. I mean,
yeah.
And this is familiar from discussions of functionalism. Functionalism, people saw, circa 1980, seem to leave out representation for just this reason. It's all inside the head and representations outside the head. And then we had long arm functionalism and so on.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So I guess the idea was that it's harder to see how brain states could have intrinsic properties in the sense required by your theory about what conscious states are. And it's easier to see how they could have representational properties, like the kinds that representationalists think are identical or supervene on or whatever, experiential properties. But that's a hard problem. But so anyway, but I wonder if I could get you to talk about this materialist panpsychist fluff that's been going around. So I know Philip has accused you of being a panpsychist because of some of the things that you're saying. And I don't think that's right, but I wonder if you could just say why it's not right.
Philip Goff, panpsychist, he gets a lot of flack, and he's desperately in need of allies. So I don't want to give him a hard time, because I do think he's a perfectly serious philosopher. And the people who are so sniffy about panpsychism ought to look more at the arguments that push a lot of people in that direction.
Agreed. Yeah, agreed.
So, but all that happened, last thing I wrote about consciousness, I'm going to write something else about it soon. I said, look, I'm not really convinced about the need to find a category of a kind phenomenal consciousness that's different from access consciousness. I mean, there's clearly access consciousness, and there's different views about how you might define it, but it's just kind of why think that there's phenomenal consciousness in addition, and it makes us kind of look around for some physical arrangements that somehow have a special kind of glow or kind of pixie dust on them, and I think that's all a bad idea. There's just lots of physical stuff, and then I said some of that physical stuff gets to be part of organism systems that distinguish between the inside and the outside, and so that get something to be. I'm just thinking in biological terms, a kind of an individual with a point of view on reality. And once you've got that, then you've got a subject in these physical states, the ones that are playing a role inside these organisms, helping them to find their way around, are there for those subjects. And maybe consciousness doesn't involve anything more than an ordinary material state being there for a subject, where subject again is just cashed out in kind of biological functional terms. And then I said, so at this point, there's something similar between my view and the panpsychist. I think that any kind of material state, give or take, but with a bit of complexity, is got the wherewithal to be conscious. All it needs is for some subject to be using it, and it's there for the subject. And so, you know, there's nothing special about the physical states that are conscious. I mean, you know, they're all perfectly capable of being conscious, if only they're embedded enough. And Philip got very excited. You know, there's David. He says all physical states are being conscious, and so that's the only point at which I'm overlapping with panpsychism. But
right. So the basic idea is just there's nothing special, metaphysically speaking, about conscious states. They don't. There's not like a deep divide in reality between the states which are phenomenally conscious and the ones that aren't.
No, I'm going to write something again, but it'll go back to what I've always thought about the problem of consciousness. That an awful lot of it is engendered by people unknowingly, unwillingly, willingly thinking in dualist terms. It's very hard to get away from the idea that brain states give rise to consciousness, that there's some kind of extra light that comes on. And I just think we've got to get away from that kind of thinking. It's all physical stuff, but some physical systems are ones where certain states are like something for the beings that have them, in the sense that they're there for those beings, and there's nothing more to consciousness than that. And we have that ourselves, of course, all over the place, and then we get confused and think it involves something extra to the physical goings on. But
I mean, there would have to be one condition, though, that was in place, which is that the whatever physical states were going to play this role, it would have to have the character of being, well, I don't know, the kinds of things which could be intrinsic in the way that we've been talking about. Not everything can have that property, can it? That it depends just on you and nothing going on outside of you. Some things are sort of essentially depending on things going on outside or around in the environment.
Yeah, I'm not so sure how much I'm committed to that. Intrinsic to, so are bits of your body that aren't in your brain, can they contribute to your consciousness? I'm never very sure about that. Are bits of my body which are kind of outside my skin, can they contribute to my consciousness? I don't have any very strong feelings about that. So all the stuff that's got to be intrinsic that I have in the book, it's probably just as well I don't stop and define intrinsic, because I'm not too strict about it, you know, just being inside the skin. But I am, I mean, yeah,
it's got to be.
I mean, a relation between a state of my brain and a possible property that's sometimes instantiated around here and sometimes not, that's very unintrinsic, and that can't be conscious. But I'm not, yeah.
So what's your?
I'm never quite sure where the boundaries are for something to, you know, could that possibly be part of what makes me conscious like the way I am?
What's your take on the like neural prosthetic line? So if I found the part of your brain that was, you know, doing the red star thing, and I replaced it with a computer chip doing having the same physical properties, is the red star preserved, or does it go away on your view?
I'm inclined to think it's not the basic physical substance that matters, but the structure. I mean, I put it like that. The ontology of traditional orthodox functionalism is a horrible mess, and the kinds of properties that are posited by functionalists just don't look like the kinds of things that can do anything. But I think that what's shared by me and Commander Data, that's what matters for consciousness, and what's different between us doesn't matter.
I see. So you can't be a hardcore identity theorist then about red star.
Yeah, they're generic physical properties, and I'll equate the conscious property with them. It's Determinable determinants like Stephen Yablo
Yeah.
does it. I mean, we share something which is surely something physical, but it's a pretty generic property. It's not to do with the makeup of our neurons. It's to do with the way they're connected.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, anyway, so we've been going on for 2.5 hours, so I got to let you go at some point. I wonder just finally if I could ask if there was anything which you were hoping would come up, which hasn't come up. And the answer can be no, but I just like to check.
No, just I'll finish with a methodological point, which is there at the beginning of the book. I mean, there are all these different views in the philosophy of perception, particularly naive realism and representationalism, and then my purely qualitative, it's all inside the head view. And I think my view is much uglier than the other views. Kind of nasty view, you're kind of stuck, and there's no kind of built-in connections between the conscious states, what you can introspectively access, and the world beyond. It's nice to have the world kind of available to you, and but I don't think philosophy is a beauty contest, and I think when we look at the theories carefully, the other ones are full of fatal flaws, and the ugly view is the only one that stands up to analysis and facts. So in philosophy we should follow the argument where it goes.
Yeah, I know there is an emphasis sometimes on simplicity, parsimony, elegance, and sometimes they don't win is kind of the moral of your story, it sounds like.
Same as science.
Yeah. Okay. Well, on that note, then I say thank you for rejoining me. This is a good discussion. I learned a lot. I think this book is excellent. I highly recommend it when it comes out. I hope people get it. There's something in there for everybody. So thanks for writing it, and thanks for taking the time to talk with me about it.
Thank you for being so patient with me. That was a lot of fun, and hope to see you around somewhere soon.
Yeah, totally. So just hang out for a second. I'll say bye off air, but I'm gonna end the stream now. And we're clear. All right. So we're